Your Bibles with you this morning. Let's turn to Hosea and chapter number 6, the book of Hosea and chapter number 6. Y'all did a great job this morning. Didn't they do a great job leading us in worship this morning? I thought they did just a wonderful job. As a side note, if you would like to be safest here at the church and socially distance the best thing you can do is be a drummer in the worship team. Am I right about that, Chris? It's the most socially distancing for 11 years now, right? You can come and be a part of that anytime you want, but we are thankful for them. They did such a great job. Hosea and chapter number 6 this morning. Hosea and chapter number 6, and soon they're going to get some slides up there for us. Hosea chapter number 6, and we're going to look at the fourth part in our Hosea series, the healing of God. The healing of God. Hosea chapter number 6. We have been doing this series in the book of Hosea, contrasting the faithfulness of God to His faithless bride. And we have talked at great length about what really happens in the book of Hosea is that it's lessons in grace. Hosea is lessons in grace. And basically what we've been doing is week by week looking at each of these lessons, right? We've been trying to understand what God is doing as He's teaching us about Himself and how He dispenses grace in our lives. Lesson number 1 was that God's grace is an extension of His power, right? God's grace is an extension of His power. And Hosea chapter 1 verse 7 really capitalizes on that, shows us what that looks like, because basically the Assyrians have come against Israel and Judah, and God has promised Judah that He's going to save them, not by their strategy, not by their power, not by their might, but that He's going to save them by His power, by His might. He says that He will save them not by sword or by bow or by horses or horsemen or war, but rather He will save them by the Lord their God. And we saw in the Old Testament as we went back to 2 Kings in chapter 18 and 19 that there was an appearance of Christ at this specific moment in history, and that some 185,000 Assyrian soldiers are wiped out in one night. God's grace is an extension of His power. When we come to the New Testament, we see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, how God says there that not many of them were wise or powerful or mighty, but that God uses instead the foolish things of the world to confound the wise and the weak to confound the strong and the powerful. God's grace is an extension of His power. Lesson number 2 on grace is that grace can sometimes be painful. In other words, when we talk about grace, we oftentimes get caught up in the salvation. We get caught up in the ooey-gooey feelings, the love. When we think of the term grace, we think of forgiveness. But sometimes grace is painful to go through. We looked at Hosea chapter 2 and verse 3, the second half of it specifically, where he says, I will make her like a wilderness. I'm going to make her desolate, right? I'm going to make her like a parched land, and I will kill her of thirst. God had to bring the people of Israel and Judah to the brink of despair before they would turn to Him, where they would experience that grace as a powerful force in their life. And that was, even in that pain, there was the grace of God. Sometimes it can be painful. Lesson number 3 was last week, and that is that God's grace pursues us, right? And we looked at chapter 3 and specifically verses 1 to 2, how God tells Hosea to model this by going down again and pursuing after his wife and marrying her, love her again. And Hosea says there in verse number 2 that he went down to the marketplace and he bought her. So this is the picture of grace that's being developed. That God's grace is His power, that it's sometimes painful, bringing us to the end of ourselves, and that it's always in pursuit of us. That God is not restrained by those things that restrain mortal men, but that He comes after us. This morning I want to look at a fourth lesson in grace in the book of Hosea, and that is that grace is sometimes that God will use pain as a pathway to His providence. That God will use pain as a pathway to His providence. If you look at the book of Hosea in its entirety and read from chapter 1 to its conclusion, what you find out is that from beginning to end, the story of Hosea is a contrast of faithfulness versus unfaithfulness. It is a story of how God is always faithful, right? God is shown as this unending faithful one, this faithful groom, always going after His bride, toward His bride. And yet she is seen, through Gomer and the marriage with Hosea, she is seen as anything but faithful, right? She loves the things that sin provides. She loves the beautiful jewelry, the wages. She loves the vineyard. She loves the prestige. She even loves the beautiful or the beautiful garments that come with it. But what Hosea is doing in this moment as he buys her back, as he goes down in chapter 3 and he buys her back, he's showing her that all of those things are leaving her empty because all of those things in and of themselves are empty themselves, right? That all of those things that Gomer thinks are providing for her, all of those things that Gomer is so in love with, well, in reality, those things aren't filling her at all. They're not actually even deposits on her account, but they are debits, as it were. And that's true of all sin. We talked about this last week in the New Testament correlation. We oftentimes think that sin gives to us, but the reality is sin always takes away. It's always debiting against our account. With every compromise, what Gomer found out was that she was really losing more of her dignity, more of her beauty, more of her pride. Sin has this elusive promise that it's going to give to us everything we could have ever wanted, and yet in reality, it's always taking away from us. But what God does with Hosea and this marriage is He shows us that He never blinks. That He's faithful despite every bad decision. That He's in pursuit despite every road that sin takes us down. That when we should have given up on us and thrown the clay away, that He doesn't do that. But He merely picks the pieces up and begins to remold them, remake them, and reshape them into who He wants us to be. There's a powerful truth in that, right? This week you saw on Facebook, and you'll see it throughout this month and into the next month, that we put up a display about how faithful, and underneath it says that He is faithful, we are called to be faithful, He is faithful, everything's couched in that. He is faithful, He is faithful, I want to be faithful, He is faithful. The powerful truth of Hosea's message is that no matter who we are, no matter what we have to offer or lack thereof, no matter every bad decision, that God is constantly faithful. He's not restrained in His grace toward us, and He's always ready to remake and remold us. Isn't that a powerful truth this morning? That God never gives up on us. I'm thankful for that, even if you're not. When we got through with that, into that second song, and we got ready to transition into that second song, and nobody clapped, I thought, that's like when the preacher says something powerful and nobody amens. You know what I mean? Like we're really not sure what to do. I'm thankful for that truth this morning. I'm thankful that God is in the business of remolding and remaking, right? Because if not, I'd be in a world of hurt today. I'm thankful that He doesn't throw the pot away just because it doesn't seem to turn out the way that it should. He just begins to remold, remake, reshape into the image of His Son, Jesus Christ. But even though God is faithful, even though we know this truth, even though this powerful truth undergirds our life itself, even though we claim it, can we get a witness this morning and say we don't always feel it? Even though we know that truth, even though we know God's not done with us yet, even though we know He's still making us, even though we know how faithful God is, sometimes in our lives, don't we get to places where we just don't, and I'm going to use that word intentionally, where we just don't feel it? Sometimes the bad news seems to be so persistent that we really kind of lose sight of the good news. Kind of had this conversation with a deacon not that long ago about just how all of the events that have surrounded the last several of months, if you just turn on your TV and you watch Fox News, it can just get really depressing, can it? Or CNN, or ABC, or whatever. It just gets depressing. And then when you're stranded at home and you just got to watch it, it just starts playing tricks on your mind, and you just get caught up in it, and it just gets overwhelming. We know the truth that God is faithful. But sometimes we just don't feel it. Sometimes we don't sense it like we should because we're just so, that bad news seems to be so persistent. I think of the psalmist in Psalm 51 when he says that my sin is ever before me. It's like everywhere I go, it's just always in front of me. There's never any type of good news. This week on Facebook, I shared the story of Dr. Michelle Bingston. She's a clinical neuropsychologist from Dallas, Texas, and I thought I'd refresh you on it again, but her story is one of pain. Every time it seemed like her life was beginning to get manageable, pain was just around the corner. As a child, she became disfigured because of disease at an early age. Her father died when she was an adolescent, and after her father's death, her mother remarried a more harsh man and moved the family away from what she had known, so she lost all of her friends and her connections and all the things that were kind of keeping her life stable. Dealing with all of that pain and maybe finally getting to a good place, she married a great man, she says, and she started a family. And as soon as she started a family, she found out that her husband would be diagnosed with cancer. And the doctor said, get your affairs in order because he's not going to probably even live to see your children grow. Following a miraculous recovery on his part, what happened next? Well, she was diagnosed with an illness and she was put on bed rest for 5 months. There on bed rest for 5 months, she battled depression and fatigue. And because of her job, she knew what medicines would be prescribed. And yet, none of them seemed to work for her, right? Only she found out that everything she'd told her clients over the years was failing because it didn't work for her. She got through that time and she wrote a book about it, about the goodness of God. And the goodness of God seemed to be showing itself again in her life. And then she was diagnosed with cancer because that wasn't enough. Through it all, she wrote a thought that I want us to consider this morning. She wrote these words, "Yet what I have discovered is that God never wastes our pain." Let me say it again. Yet what I have discovered is that God never wastes our pain. Truly, what the enemy intends to harm us, God will use for good and for His glory. Beloved, this morning, the pathway of providence is often littered with pain. The pathway of providence is often littered with pain. Given our preference in life, we'd like to skip it all, right? We'd much rather God's plan for our life include much more pleasure and less pain, right? That's what makes the health and wealth preaching of some word of faith movements so popular, because it promises a life that's free from sin. But beloved, that's just not biblical. It's not true. It's not even experiential. One of my favorite stories is being in India with Brother Dean several years ago, and we were sitting having lunch with Pastor Jolly one day, and Jolly works as an interpreter, and he's used by several different folks, including religious institutions, the Billy Graham Evangelism Association, as well as the UN and others. He's just a wonderful translator, and he was telling us a story about a few years before how Benny Hinn had come and to do a healing service, but had to cancel one night because he'd gotten sick, right? We live in a sin-sick world, right? We can't avoid these things. The preaching of such is popular to us because that's what we want. We want a life with less pain and more pleasure. But the reality is that's not what God promises us at all. Not in His Word. It's not what we experience. In fact, I'm going to suggest completely the opposite today. Beloved, that's not what we need. God promises us that He'll be faithful, that He'll see us through things, that He is providential. And even pain is a part of God's providence because God knows exactly what we need. God knows exactly what we need this morning. If I could speak candidly, I have seen a lesson in 18 years of ministry that I think is worthy of our consideration this morning. Pain has a way of producing one of two results in people. And that is that I think it's what the Apostle Peter wrote about in his first epistle when he spoke about the fiery trial that the believer experiences in his life. Fire, pain, beloved, it has a way of showing our nature, doesn't it? What we're made of. It shows our character. The fire doesn't give us character. It shows what our character is. When stubble and grain are put to fire, listen, they're consumed. But when steel is subjected to the same heat, what happens? It strengthens. So too are the fires of life, beloved. So too is God's providence and pain. The pain of life, it doesn't determine who you are. The pain of life, the struggles in life, they don't determine who you are. It doesn't even discriminate. In the words of Christ, the rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous, the just and the unjust. But what fire does do in our life, what pain does do in our life, is the fires of providence, they accomplish in us, that is, they show us our nature. They reveal to us what our character is. They don't give us character, but they show us what we are. They show us whether we're made of something that's flammable or something that will be strengthened. Is that important? You bet it is. Maybe I could put it in these terms. We often wonder, why me? Why does God choose me for such pain? I recently had this discussion with somebody. Why would God give us this pain? Why would we have to be the ones to deal with it? I want to say two things that I said to them that morning. I want you to listen to me close. I would suggest that first and foremost, that's a short-sighted view of pain. I don't want to be calloused. I don't want to minimize whatever pain you might be in this morning. But such view, what it does is it assumes that you understand the pain of others and that yours is somehow worse. What I've learned in pastoring over these years is that I very rarely fully understand the pain behind the smiles. We're not singled out, beloved. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. And when we ask those questions, we have to be careful, because sometimes what we're saying is, I've got it way worse than somebody else has it. This morning, that's just not true. Second, I would remind you that the tests are never for the teacher. Am I right about that? The teacher always knows what the answers are. The tests are for the student. They're to show the student what they need to improve on, where they need to learn. I think pain works that way in our life. Through it, God uses His providence to teach us lessons about our character. He shows us whether we're made of gold or steel, or whether we're made of grain and stubble, right? We can conclude this morning there is a purpose in all pain. It's not random. It's not meaningless. Pain is providential. It's providential. It's purposeful. We come to Hosea chapter 6. As we come to Hosea 6, there's a question that has to be answered, right? There's a question that has to be answered. And that question is, what is that purpose in pain? Is pain a part of God's providence? Then what is its purpose? If it is, what am I supposed to do with it? What should I do in pain? Beloved, I can't control pain, right? I can't bring it to its end, nor even can I hasten its end. Maybe I can't even speed it up. Am I supposed to just grit my teeth in pain? Hosea wastes no time in answering that question. In verse number 1, in the first part of verse number 1, he says, "Come, let us return to the Lord." The reason for Israel and Judah's pain was their sin, right? They had done wrong. This was God's discipline on them. Now, all pain is a result of sin, but I want to be really clear. We don't believe that just because you're going through something, that necessarily means that God is trying to discipline you in some manner. In other words, there are some out there, like Job's friends, for example, that say, if you're going through something in life, it must be because God is trying to discipline you. You've done something wrong. Repent, and then it will go away. No, beloved, sometimes pain is a part of His providence, but it's not necessarily a part of His discipline, right? It's not a part of His justice, so to speak. Sometimes it is merely God's way of trying to get our attention. Isn't it amazing how often when we're in those painful moments, we're spending more time in prayer, spending more time in His Word? Listen, I'm playing in a spring 3-man tournament this weekend, and I've never prayed so hard in all my life because I didn't want to be embarrassed, right? You know, we sometimes forget that it's in those moments of utter despair. That's when God has our attention the best, right? All the pain, it's an opportunity for recalibration, right? It's an opportunity to rethink. And in that recalibration, there's also healing. If you go on in verse number 1 a little bit further, in the second half of it, it says, "For He has torn us, that He may heal us." Third half of us, "He has struck us down, and He will bind us up." It reminded me of the words from our men's study of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 in the second Beatitude a couple of weeks ago. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Mourning, that's not a pleasant experience, is it? But having those big arms wrapped around you, there's something pleasant about that. There's something soothing about that tranquility, about that encouragement. Friday night, we went up to Columbia to take Isaiah out for his birthday dinner, and we took him to the Japanese steakhouse. That's one of our favorite stops, right? We only get to go there on Isaiah's birthday because we have to spend the rest of the year collecting money to pay for it. But we go there, and we're getting up to the table, and Zariah decided to do a Zariah type of thing. She looks up, and there's these dishes that they put the yum-yum sauce in. You know what I'm talking about? Of course you do. And it's sitting next to the... Yes, some of you just went yum. Listen, I need you to focus. I know lunch is coming, but anyway, she reaches up to grab one of those dishes, and when she does, she puts her arm up there and hits it on the grill, right? And, you know, I was a good parent. I was like, rub some dirt on it, you'll be fine, you know. She burns her arm on that grill, and little Zariah, she's the tough one of the family. Isaiah catches the common cold, and you would think it's the bubonic plague. I mean, that kid rolls around on the floor, woe is me. Zariah, she gets COVID-19, and she's like, can I go play with the neighbor now? She's just out there and ready at it, right? No tears. She's never, you know, she just doesn't seem to show that expression. And she goes and sits down in her chair, and I saw it happen, right? She rips her arms back, and she comes and sits down in that chair next to me, and she's just sitting there going, I want to cry, but I'm not supposed to, right? I'm going to be tough. And I'm leaning over and I'm like, you okay? Is your arm all right? And she's sitting there rubbing it. I'm fine. Do you want to go home? Do you want to eat? We're fine. I want to eat, And she's just trying to hang in there as best as she can, right? Until eventually it just got a little overwhelming, right? Of course, all the people around us were the better parents. They're coming up and offering their solutions to this problem, right? We're like, she's fine. She's just a big baby. But anyway, finally, after the dam breaks and the water starts coming, I reach over and I pick her up and I put her on my lap, right? And I put my arms and I said, are you going to be okay? Yes. I said, do you want to stay here? Do you want to sit on my lap? Yes. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Pain is terrible. We don't want to experience it. And yet there's some great experience of grace in that moment when we have those arms wrapped around us. We don't particularly enjoy what got us to that comfort, but with Jesus, blessed are those who mourn, he says, for they shall be comforted. He's the one who wraps his arms around them. Chapter 6, verse 2 of Hosea, he goes on, and he says, after 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up that we may live before him. I want to go through two main thoughts here. First and foremost, generally speaking, what Hosea is promising is for the future redemption of Israel. The prophet, as the mouthpiece of God, is essentially saying in this moment, your pain is only going to last for a little while. And then God's going to restore you. It seems like it's a lot, I know, but it's only going to be just a little while. In fact, I particularly love that phrase, that we may live before him. One translation translates it like this. It says that we may live in his sight. You will not get out of his view. We'll be within his view. Israel's national revival was just around the corner. That's what the prophet is promising. The national revival, it's just around the corner. Just hang in there. It seems like a lot. Wouldn't that be a great word for today? America, your revival is just around the corner. It's just 2 days you're going to be hard-pressed, and then you will be revived again on that third day. By the way, the Jews believed that a body had to be in the tomb for 3 days before it was actually dead. It took 3 days for the soul to leave. So essentially what the prophet is doing is he's drawing upon that illustration and saying, you are as close to death as you could imagine, but God is going to revive you. Your revival is right around the corner. Do not give up. Do not give in. Just hang with it a little while longer. The recovery was going to be swift. And then they would feel the warmth of his embrace, his presence. They would feel what it meant to be in his sight, to understand they were in his presence. Beloved, this world is fleeting. It's passing away, isn't it? Some days it seems like our pain will never stop. It seems like joy and gladness have left us for good. But the prophet's message to us is that even if the world would be filled with terror and goodness never shined her face upon me, this life is but a fleeting moment in comparison to all of eternity. It's fleeting, it's passing away. The second application of this is very obvious to you and I as we live in New Testament days and post the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The prophet may have even had a glimpse into what was coming in Jesus. Scourged for the weight of our sin, beaten and bruised for our iniquity. He was buried in the tomb, but having defeated death, hell, and the grave, right? He rose in triumphant victory.